Hello, everybody. My name is Susan Hamburger, and I'm a member of the board of directors of Chevy Chase at Home, and a longtime member and volunteer. And I want to welcome you to this installment of our speaker series, which today our guest speaker today will be Steve Roberts. As you know, Chevy Chase at Home, you all understand the village concept. We help older people age in place, both in person and virtually. And I think the virtual part is never going to go away because of wonderful platforms like this. At least I hope it won't, because it's such an easy way to see so many interesting things and learn so much. We plan to record today's session for those who can't be with us, and we invite your questions, but Steve would prefer that we wait till the end. So put your questions in the chat and I will pull them up when he's finished. Now I'd like to introduce you to a man that probably all of you have heard of, maybe some of you have met. Steve Roberts has been a journalist for 50 years. He started with the New York Times and US News. He teaches at George Washington University, and I understand that he teaches a course on media ethics. I would love to have you come back and talk about that subject one time, if it's of interest to you. He's an author. He's written 8 books. He's a political analyst for ABC. He's a father and a beloved grandfather. And we're so happy that he is here today. Thanks, Steve. Go ahead if you can start.
Well, thank you, Susan. I really appreciate that. And I appreciate very much what the Chevy Chase Village does. And, you know, we've been part of this community a long, long time. I mean, you mentioned aging in place. So I've lived in this house for 46 years here on Bradley Boulevard. Cokie and I moved back here in 1977. A few years ago, I got new knees. I'm 80 years old, but my knees are only 5 years old. And so I was, the social worker came to check out the house and found one of the banister coming up to the second floor. And she said, you know, this is kind of shaky. And if you decide to age in place, you should replace the banister. And I basically said, what the hell do you think I've been doing for 40 years? I've been aging in place right here for a long time. Yeah. So I do understand the concept, the village concept. And but the connections of our family to this community go back long before that. They actually go back to 1940. In 1940, Cokie's dad, Hale Boggs, was elected to the Congress from Louisiana, from New Orleans. He was only 26 years old. His wife, Lindy, was 24. Cokie was not even born yet, but her brother, Tommy, sister Barbara were toddlers. And they moved to Washington in 1941, one of the most important years in American political history. Then Hale was defeated in the election of 42. He went into the Navy over World War II. And then in 46, was reelected to the Congress. And so that's when the family moved into a house on Stevenson Place, right there in Chevy Chase, right over the district line, right near Blessed Sacrament Church, and within walking distance for Blessed Sacrament, which was where the family has gone to church for many, many years. Then in 1952, they bought this house on Bradley Boulevard, where I'm sitting right now. So do the math. You know, 1952 was a long time ago, and that's how long this family has been connected. But I didn't, you know, Cokie went to Stone Ridge, as many of you know, Catholic girls' school right up here on Rockville Pike, and always was deeply devoted to the Madams of the Sacred Heart. And the nuns who taught her, in fact, several of her books are dedicated to them. But then she went off to Wellesley, and she was the first and only of the 3 children in the family to go to a non-Catholic school at any stage of their education. And the story is told, which I've told many times, Hale and Lindy, my in-laws, drove Cokie to Wellesley, and it was sort of an uncharacteristic gesture of parental responsibility because they're right in the middle of the Kennedy campaign. Think about this, this is the fall of 1960. Jack Kennedy, the first Catholic to be elected president, was very close to my in-laws, and they were right in the middle of the campaign, but they took a couple of days to drive Cokie. And my sainted mother-in-law, Lindy, who many of you knew I was, the joke in the family is I fell in love with Lindy first and got around to Cokie, and that's actually true. But my in-laws are driving off the Wellesley campus, and some of you know one of the most beautiful classic college campuses in America. And my mother-in-law turns to my father-in-law, bursts into tears and says, "I've left my baby at a Yankee Protestant Republican school." And I always said to my mother-in-law, well, what was the worst of the three? And it always changed, of course. But the Jewish son-in-law, strike four, he wasn't even in the picture yet. I didn't come along till a couple of years later. But the first time I ever came to this community, first time I ever came to Washington, and the first time I was ever in this house where I'm sitting now, it was 1962. Cokie and I had met, actually it was the spring of 1963. We'd met in 1962 between our sophomore and junior years at a student political meeting. And she was at Wellesley, I was at Harvard. Our dorms were 12.5 miles apart. We dated a couple of times that fall, and then like a total jerk, I stopped calling. I don't know what I was thinking, but well, she was the first serious girlfriend I'd ever had, and I didn't know what the hell I was doing. And also the religious difference at that time was considered an enormous problem for both of us, both of our families.
Yeah.
So we didn't really see each other for about 4 or 5 months. In the spring of 1963, there's a student political meeting here in Washington, yet another meeting, which Cokie's older sister was actually running. And a group of us were going to come from Boston down to this meeting, and I was going to cover it for the Harvard Crimson. And one thing led to another, and there was a group of us who were going to drive down from Boston to Washington for this meeting. And a bunch of us were going to stay here at the Boggs house. So I approached the car in the back street of Cambridge on Mount Auburn Street. Some of you are familiar with Mount Auburn Street in Cambridge. And there, sitting in the back seat, was Cokie Boggs, who I had not seen for 4 or 5 months. And I looked through the back window of the car, saw her there, and said, "You idiot. What have you been doing? This is clearly the girl for you." And I got in the car, we drove down. And this is the first time I came to Chevy Chase, first time I came to Bethesda, first time I came to Washington, spring of 1963. And that evening, that night, I was ensconced in Cokie's girlhood room, which is right across the hall from where I'm sitting right now. And I'm coughing because I've spent the winter in Boston, and you cough your way through the winter in Boston. And I hear a knock on the door. Now, this is 1963, so I assume it's not Cokie. Door opens, and in walks my future mother-in-law, future 9-time member of Congress, future ambassador to the Vatican, okay? Set the scene. In an off-the-shoulder peach-colored negligee. I had never seen a vision like this in Bayonne, New Jersey, believe me, ever. And I'm dumbstruck. And she says to me, "Why, darling?" Which is her universal form of address. "Why, darling? You sound terrible. Drink this." And hands me a glass, which I'm sure was at least 2/3 bourbon. And I was just in shock. And as I say, the joke in the family is I fell in love with my mother-in-law first. And I did, almost immediately. The next day, we have the student political meeting. And that night, that's Saturday night, it turns out that a bunch of the other guys who were supposed to stay in this house, for one reason or another, didn't show up. And I was the only one who was staying here. And Cokie and I stayed up all night in a room that's directly below where I'm sitting right now, directly below. And we started to figure out that maybe we had a future together, and maybe the religious difference was not going to be insuperable. And really, we were together from that weekend on. Spring of 1963, right in this same house. Now, it took me 3 years more to actually get married. I was slow, right? I was very slow, but we got married right here. I'm out the window where I'm sitting right now, in the yard of this house, the garden of this house. And there were 1,500 people at the wedding. my mother-in-law and father-in-law decided to solve all of their social obligations by inviting folks. Now, this is 1966. Lyndon Johnson was in the White House. He and my in-laws were very close. So the president came, and 1,498 other people. And look, my mother-in-law couldn't afford to cook for that many. So talk about a village, right? She had a village of her own long before the formal founding of Chevy Chase Village. My mother-in-law had her own village here in this neighborhood, and she farmed out all of the food for this wedding of 1,500 people to all of her neighbors. But some of it, for weeks, you would walk into the kitchen here at Bradley Boulevard, and you'd see a sign on the oven that said, "I'm a ham, take me out at 4." And that's how we fed 1,500 people. Since then, there have been 5 other weddings. There have been 6 weddings in this yard as I look out as the sun just started shining. And so it's really sacred space. And this place, this neighborhood, this community has been so important to us over so many years. And then we left. You know, we got married, we moved to New York, we moved to Los Angeles, we moved to Athens, Greece, for my job as a reporter on the New York Times. And this was hard on Cokie. You know, she, people don't realize this, but when she was just a kid, in the year before we graduated, the year before we were married, she actually had her own TV show on the local station here in WRC. It was called Meeting of the Minds, and it was a Sunday morning talk show. It was actually a lead-in on NBC to Meet the Press. And then we got married in 1966, 2 years after graduating from college. And you know, in the nature of life in those years, this meant that my job was more important. We didn't even have a conversation about whose job was more important. So we moved to New York, and she's very unhappy and can't find a job. And now this is a woman who eventually wrote six best-selling books. I have them on the shelf right next to me right now. And she was told by Newsweek magazine and many other people, we do not hire women to be writers, period. As if there was some congenital disability that went with being a female, that somehow having a uterus meant you couldn't write. I mean, it was, and she often said years later, if I had taken a tape recorder with me, I could have sued the hell out of all of these men who were being so sexist and so discriminatory. But that was life in 1966. And she was very depressed about it. And there's a story that I tell. I told it at Cokie's funeral, but I love this story because it's so personal. And you know, given what happened to Cokie, and given the fact that she became one of the most famous journalists of her age, here she was in 1966, depressed, couldn't find a job, a new bride. And as she told the story, she had to struggle every day to sort of get over her depression and do something constructive. And so one of the things she vowed that she would do would be return some of our wedding presents. 1,500 people, you got a lot of presents to return. But as she told the story, she couldn't organize herself enough to get dressed. So she put on a coat over her nightgown and went to the east side of New York, where she was returning some piece of silver from a then well-known New York store called Jorg Jensen's. And she's standing online and finds herself standing behind the man in the couple who gave us the wedding present. Now, what are the odds? There are 8 million people in New York City, and she's standing there at Jorg Jensen directly behind the guy who gave us the present. Now, she figures he's a guy. He doesn't have a goddamn clue about what the present was, right? So maybe she can get away with this. So she's standing there, and our friend Terry Smith gets to the front of the line, and he has a problem with the return he's making and calls his wife and says, guess who I met on the line? And Cokie says, oh. I am busted. And the wife, of course, knows exactly what Cokie's doing and says, what is she returning? And of course, Terry tells her, Cokie's totally busted. The two women get on the phone, they're laughing about it. And Terry, who was a New York Times reporter, says, look, Cokie, no hard feelings. So look, I'm about to go cover Nelson Rockefeller swearing in as his new term of governor. And why don't you come with me? Cokie's in her nightgown, but she's got the coat on. So she says, okay, Terry. And they go to townhouse on the east side where Rockefeller's being sworn in. And there are all these old TV lights. It's sweltering in this place. And everybody says to Cokie, can we take your coat? And she says, no, I'm from the South. I'm always cold. I'm going to keep on because she's in her nightgown. And so she gets through the whole swearing in, and Terry is still trying to be nice and says, okay, Cokie, now let's go to lunch. And Cokie says, in a fit of sanity, I said, no, Terry, no lunch. I'm going home. But I tell that story, and she told that story because to show you that, everybody, no matter how successful, goes through these periods of imposter syndrome and frustration. And it was particularly true of women of her age. And we get to California. She does some work as a TV producer for children's television. And she was quite successful at it. But then we moved to Greece, and she couldn't produce TV shows in Greece because she didn't know the language. So she connects as sort of a part-time reporter with CBS. And I have a letter that she wrote home. And it's so touching, this letter, because it's to her childhood friend, Cinda Pratt, who grew up on Rosemary Street in Chevy Chase. And she says to Cinda, they've given me a tape recorder, and they're going to try me out, CBS. And if I do okay, they'll take me on. When you read this letter and think about what happened to her just a few years later, but she was so excited just because CBS gave her a tape recorder. And not long after we arrived in Greece, there was a coup in Cyprus. And I flew off to cover the coup in Cyprus. And 2 days later, the Turks invaded Cyprus, and the Greek government starts to fall. It's a military government. And all of the English language reporters in that part of the Mediterranean are in Cyprus to cover the coup. But in fact, the decline of the military government in Athens was even a bigger story. And there was Cokie. She had never done a radio report in her life. Think about it, the founding mother of NPR, never done a radio report in her life. And CBS cables her and says that the Turks, 2 days after the coup, the Turks invaded Cyprus. And she said, and they say, the Turks have invaded Cyprus. Can you file a radio spot in 30 minutes? We had house guests staying with us, and Cokie had sprained her ankle, and she was on a cane. And they say that this at 6:30 in the morning, this apparition appeared in the doorway of our house, the guest room in Athens, waving her cane and saying, the Turks have invaded, I must go file. And Cokie makes her way down to the Reuters office where I had made friends, cobbles together a piece. And I have no idea what's happening. I'm in Cyprus. I'm under fire. There's a war going on in Cyprus. And I have no idea what's happening back in Athens. 2 days later, the Greek government falls. And Cokie gets a radio report out to CBS. And that night they call Lindy, who was living in this house at the time. And they say, Mrs. Boggs, do you have a picture of your daughter? And my mother-in-law is so upset. She says, what's wrong? What's wrong? No, there's nothing wrong. It's just that we want to use Cokie's radio report. It's the only report CBS has out of Greece. It's the lead story in the world. It's the most important story in the world. All we have is her radio report, and we want to run it, but we want to run her picture while we run the audio on the Walter Cronkite show tonight. So she leads the Cronkite show. Again, I have no idea this is happening. About 4 days later, I finally get a military flight out of Cyprus to the UK, back from London. I walk through the door in our house in Athens and find I am married to a veteran foreign correspondent. When I had left 8 days before, she had never filed a radio report. And right place, right time, but she was smart enough and talented enough to take advantage of it. That was really the beginning of her broadcast career. I mean, she had done these other things earlier. As I said, she hosted a show as a kid, but this was a real breakthrough for her. And yet, when we came back to Washington a few years later, she was very upset about it. She was still very uneasy. She was almost 34 years old and still had never been a full-time working journalist, 34. And she was very uneasy about the job market here, very uneasy about her ability to make her way. And we moved into this house. Lindy, by this time, Lindy's husband Hale had died in '72. Lindy had taken over the house and was, a member of Congress at this point. But she was living in this big suburban house all by herself. And it immediately became clear that the best thing to do was for us to buy this house from Lindy. Our kids were 7 and 9. It was the Pyle Whitman School District. It was, it made all the sense in the world. But Cokie was very upset about being back. This was the only city in the world that she was Hale and Lindy Boggs' daughter. She was the only. She really felt that she couldn't really make her way professionally because she had such a spotty resume. And she said quite rightly, that once we move back, we're never going to leave, which of course turned out to be 100% true, like most things she said. Not everything she said, but most things she said. So we moved back. And I go down to the downtown to the New York Times Bureau, where I'm rejoining the Washington Bureau. And I'm handed a desk my first day. And I look around and I see this young woman I don't recognize. I say, my name's Steve Roberts. Who are you? And she says, my name is Judy Miller. And I said, I don't recognize your byline. She said, oh, I'm new to the paper. I just joined. And I said, where did you used to work? And she said, National Public Radio. And I said, what's that? Think about it, NPR had been in existence for 5 years at that point, but we had been in Europe for 4 years. I had no idea what it was. And she explains to me what NPR was and what they were trying to do. And I just had this flash. I said, my God, that's the perfect place for my wife to work. I have this wife crying herself to sleep in Bethesda every night. What do I do? And Judy says, call my friend Nina Totenberg. Now, I had heard Nina's name, but I'd never met her. And I called today one of our closest friends. I had dinner with her 3 nights ago. I call Nina and she says, I know who you are. I know who Cokie is. Get me her resume. And the next day, I walk 2 blocks from the New York Times office to the NPR office, 23rd and M Street, with Cokie's resume. And that was the first time I ever saw the old girls network at work. The first time where I saw the ability of women, because NPR had hired more women than anybody else. And people like Nina were the senior people. They had the clout to push a resume like Cokie's through the system. And she was hired originally just as a part-timer, and they rather quickly realized that they had this mega talent on their hands, but there was still some concerns. And one of the concerns was this cutesy name she had, Cokie. And Frank Mankiewicz, then the head of NPR, said, we're a serious news organization. You should use your full real name. So Cokie, with that mischievous glint that was so much a part of her TV and radio personality, said, okay, pal. And the next day she signs off, and this is Mary Martha, Corrine Morris, and Claiborne Boggs Roberts reporting. At which point Frank Mankiewicz says, I give up, Cokie will be fine. And it actually turned out to be a great asset to her because she was the only one. It wasn't quite like Madonna, but, or Cher, but, she was known by one name for many people. As so many of you know, she became, a major figure on NPR, and then TV came calling. And the truth is, the camera loved Cokie. They just, she just had this natural ebullience that the camera loved. And I tell the story in the book I wrote about Cokie. her first day when ABC called her in just for a one-off, one-shot Sunday morning. They were looking for women to be on the round table. They had these three aging white guys, David Brinkley, George Will, Sam Donaldson. They were under great pressure to add a woman. And so they were trying out various women. And one day, people who had heard her on NPR said, we should invite Cokie. So she comes in, and Cokie at this point was a grown-up. She was in her mid-40s. She says to the producer, and this guy told me the story, that Cokie walks in, totally self-possessed, and looks at him and says, Mark, there are three things you need to know about me. I've been married to the same man for 20 years. I live in the house I grew up in, and I go to church every Sunday. And if you understand those three things about me, we're going to get along. And she wanted people to know that she was a believer. She wanted people to know she was a wife and mother. She wanted people to know she had a life outside of television, outside, and that was her basis. That was her grounding. That's who she really was. And that was true her whole life. That self-definition, I'm a daughter, I'm a wife, I'm a mother, I'm a Catholic. Those were always more important to her than being a star. And that's the way she lived her life. And people would show up at the Safeway, on Arlington Road. And she would go to a church right after her Sunday show, and then she'd go to the Safeway on Arlington Road. And people would come up to her and say, Cokie Roberts, you're doing your own grocery shopping? And she would say, duh, you want to do it for me? I'd be happy to have you do it for me. Who else is going to do my grocery shopping for me? But she always stayed, so grounded and so connected to this community. But in addition to that, there are two other things that struck me so forcibly as I did this book about her. And people ask me, why did you do the book? And really what happened was that after she died in September of 2019, I gave a eulogy at St. Matthew's Cathedral. There were 1,000 people there that night. And I just told the kind of stories I'm telling today. And people seemed to like the stories. And I decided I'd just put them all in a book, which is basically the book that I did last year. One of the things that Cokie was always noted for was promoting other women. And wherever she was, she was a counselor to young women. She was a source of support. And I didn't even realize until I started talking to a lot of these women how, the length and breadth of her devotion. Cokie was a baby freak. And if there was a baby in the zip code, Cokie sniffed it out. And she was the first one at every one of her young friends who had a baby. Cokie was the first one in the maternity ward, and she would swoop in and just swoop up the baby. And a woman named Elena Marcus tells a story about Cokie swooping in. Elena's had her first child, and Cokie says to her, Elena, you don't mind if I kind of baptize this child, don't you? And Elena says, Cokie, that's a Jewish child, don't you? And Cokie says, oh, I know, Elena, I know you're Jewish. I'm just covering your bases. You don't mind if I do this. And she was just there constantly at every baby shower, every hotel room, every funeral. One of her friends told me the story about, this is a woman who was a friend from Wellesley and a bridesmaid in our wedding, and lifelong friend of Cokie. Had two sons, and a terrible tragedy. The younger son committed suicide. And Marcia tells me the story that she's there in Northampton, Massachusetts, the morning of her son's funeral. And in walks Cokie. She said, I have no idea how she even heard about Danny's death or how she got there in time. But Cokie walks through the door, sits there with Marcia as well-wishers come through the door for the morning, and then sits next to her in the limousine going to the funeral, and stands at the graveside as she buries her child and physically holds her up. And that was Cokie. In many ways, the most important thing that I learned about her, and the most important thing that I wanted this book to communicate, was that she did something good for someone else every single day of her life, every single day. Nina Totenberg, who became one of her closest and dearest friends, tells the story about the day Nina Totenberg's first husband died. She was married to a much older man named Floyd Haskell, who was a one-term senator from Colorado. And Floyd died when they were actually on vacation in Maine, and it was complicated and difficult to transport his body back to Washington. And this is Nina talking, and Nina says, Cokie ran Floyd's death. Cokie arranged the funeral and all of the details. And then it came to go to Gawler's funeral home. Unfortunately, we were all too familiar with Gawler's funeral on Wisconsin Avenue to pick out a casket. Now, it takes a pretty good friend to say, I'm going to go with you to pick out your husband's casket, right? And so they get there, and the guy who, the obsequious salesman who's trying to upsell them to a more expensive casket, it says to Ms. Totenberg, well, this one over here, which is, much more expensive, is much bigger. And your husband was a very tall man, so he'd be much more comfortable in this big casket. Well, you can imagine saying that to Cokie Roberts and Nina Totenberg. The two of them, they catch each other's eyes and start giggling. Now, it takes a pretty good friend to go with you to pick out your husband's casket. It takes an even better friend to giggle over it, right? And, Nina has written a wonderful book, which I'm sure some of you have read, about her friendship with Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. It's a wonderful book. In fact, I'm reading it now. And, Nina came to George Washington, where I teach, one day to give a book talk. And she was being interviewed by Scott Simon, as many of you know, a longtime friend and NPR host. And at the end of this conversation, and the book's called Dinners with Ruth, it's all about her friendship with Ruth Ginsburg. And Scott Simon says to her, Nina, now that you've written this book and reflected on your relationship with Justice Ginsburg, when you're facing a difficult problem, difficult decision in your life, do you think of Ruth? And Nina says, no, I think of Cokie. She's my moral touchstone. And one of Cokie's best friends from high school, as I said, grew up on Rosemary Street. Cinder Pratt, some of you know the Pratt family. Her dad was a federal judge. And Cinder wrote to me and said, look, all my friends have these bracelets that say WWJD, what would Jesus do? I want a bracelet that says WWCD, what would Cokie do? And to this day, so many of the people who have read this book and friends of hers talk to me about this and say, this is, I still do this. I still think when I'm faced with a tough decision in my personal life, it's Cokie who's the touchstone. And the reason why this is so important and why I emphasize it in the book and why I talk about it when I talk about the book is that, look, let's be honest, not everybody can be a TV star. Not everybody can be a radio star, and not everybody can write 6 best-selling books, which she did. But everybody can be a good person. Everybody can be a good friend. And I think it's the most lasting legacy she leaves behind and the most lasting impact that she had on so many people. And as I was writing this book, Susan knew my younger brother, Glenn, through Parkinson's Foundation, still friends with my sister-in-law, Kitty. And as Glenn was declining from Parkinson's, and we knew it was coming to the end, and they only lived 15 minutes from me here. They lived over in Kensington. And Kitty called me one morning and said, look, we almost lost Glenn last night. And if you want to see him one more time, come today. So I did. And I drove over and I sat with Glenn for an hour, and he wasn't really conscious, but he was up, and I could hold his hand and I kissed him goodbye, knowing it was probably the last time I would see him. The next morning, the phone rings at 6 o'clock in the morning. Now, we all know it's very seldom good news at 6 o'clock. In fact, it's almost always bad news at 6 o'clock in the morning. And I pretty much knew before I picked up the phone what I was going to hear. And Kitty said, he died overnight. And I just wanted you to know. And now you can go back to bed. So I'm sitting there with the phone in my hand. And I literally said to myself, what would Cokie do? I didn't go back. I got up, I got dressed, and I headed for Glenn and Kitty's. And on the way, I called our sister, lives in Cambridge, and I knew that she had known Glenn died, but I called her to say, we're the last two left in the family. And I called her to say, you know, I'm heading for Glenn's because really that's what Cokie would have done. And she says to me, Stephen, you have it wrong. I said, what are you talking about, Laura? She says, Cokie would have been there last night sleeping on the couch. So later in the day, I'm talking to our son who lives in North Carolina to talk to him about his uncle who had died. I tell him the story. He says, Dad, you're both wrong. Mom would have been there the last 3 nights sleeping on the couch. And that's true. And that's why so many people, you know, say to themselves, what would Cokie do? But she had an enormous impact on this friend group. But she also, you know, the public Cokie was also tremendously important. When she went on television, one of her TV friends, a producer who had been on the NewsHour at PBS for years, said to me, you know, once Cokie started doing ABC, so many women friends of mine started saying to me, you know, I'm watching ABC now more because Cokie's there. And because Cokie asks the questions I want asked. Cokie is speaking from a perspective that I don't see from anybody else on network television. The perspective of a woman and a wife and a mother who has lived a real life and a real family and asked the questions and has the perspectives that I have. And I don't see anybody else on TV who shares my life and shares my perspectives and shares my experiences. And this was a big part of her appeal, that women identified so strongly with her. Not only women of her own generation, but also younger women. I can't tell you how many times I've been told there's a woman now who's the host of Amna Nawaz, who succeeded Judy Woodruff as the host of the NewsHour on PBS. And Amna tells me the story. Her family was from Pakistan, and she was like 10 or 12 years old. And she remembers her mother pointing to Cokie on TV on Sunday morning and saying, Amna, that's who I want you to be like. That's who you should model yourself after. Be like Cokie. And women all over the country said, watched her and said, I can be that smart. I can be that brave. I can be that independent. I can be that strong. And it was this message that women all over the country, watching her and hearing her, absorbed over many years. And then she started writing these books, you know, in midlife. She created a whole new career as a best-selling author. And her specialty was writing about women's roles in history and the forgotten roles. Because history is written by men and history is written by winners, and history is not written by wives and women who played enormously powerful roles, but were unrecognized by established male historians. And but one of the reasons why Cokie could have this insight into the incredibly important and overlooked and underappreciated role that women had played in history was because she had seen it in her own family. She had seen her mother, Lindy Boggs, be an advisor to her father and then become a member of Congress herself. She had seen Lady Bird Johnson and Betty Ford and Pauline Gore and a whole generation of women who were the modern day incarnations of Abigail Adams and Dolly Madison. And so she had this incredible advantage, this insight, because she had lived it, she had seen it, she had known these women. And when her mother was, after her father's death, and her mother decided to run for his seat in Congress, she called Lady Bird Johnson, her lifelong friend, and said, you know, Bird, I'm going to run for Hale seat, and I want you to hear it from me before you read about it in the paper. And Mrs. Johnson says, why, Lindy, darling, that's a wonderful idea, but how are you going to do it without a wife? And so Cokie absorbed this tremendous sense of the role that women had played in history. But there's one final point here, and I'll get to your questions. So if you have questions, put them in the chat. There's one final idea that Cokie very strongly embodied and talked about many times, because no one was a stronger supporter of women. No one I ever knew was in many ways a stronger, more dedicated feminist than Cokie Roberts. And she spent every day helping women, advancing women, promoting women, counseling women. But she also always said, women cannot forget our historic roles. Women cannot forget our traditional roles as the caretakers and nurturers of families. And no matter how successful we are professionally, no matter where we go, we can't lose that sight of that historic and traditional role. And she writes about, in We Are Our Mother's Daughters, her first big book, 26 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, including one week at #1. She talks about the time we were in Greece, and we were at a small museum in Marathon, which is known for other things, but Marathon was we went to the beach. But there's a small museum about the ancient civilizations, and there are these artifacts, fairly common museum, but Cokie, she was so shrewd and so insightful, and she talks about looking at the cases of artifacts, and she said, what was left of the men? Well, there were some spears and weapons, maybe some religious artifacts. But what were left of the women? Cooking utensils, sewing kits, jewelry. And she writes this wonderful line in her book. I could have picked up the tools and put on the jewels and connected to my sisters over several thousand years. And this was so central to Cokie's view of the world and so central to the message that she had. But on the back of her tombstone in Congressional Cemetery, it says, pick up the tools and put on the jewels. Because that was so central to the message she wanted people to understand from her books. So that's an overview of Cokie and her journey. Hopefully you have some questions, and ask me anything. I'm happy to answer anything anybody has in mind.
Steve, evidently you have a current or past student here who said that your media ethics course is terrific.
I always appreciate the PR help my students.
Yeah. Let's see. Somebody said, thank you for a wonderful reflection on Cokie's life and your partnership with her. I have a question. Did Cokie enjoy being a mother as well?
Oh, enormously. You know, in fact, we had been married maybe a week or two when she started lobbying for a baby. But there's kind of a funny story about it, because this was the mid 60s, right? We married in 1966, and both of us were reporting about the anti-war movement, and I had been going to school at night to stay out of the Army, and we both misread the law, and we thought that having a baby would keep me out of the draft. It turns out it didn't, because I already had a fatherhood deferment, and she was 7 months pregnant with our son in the summer of 1968, when we realized that we had misread the law. But we did have the baby in October of '68, and 2 days later, literally 2 days later, I helped Cokie come back from the hospital, Beth Israel Hospital on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. We were living on the Upper West Side. In fact, not long after the baby was born, And he was born in the middle of the night, and so I was there all night. And finally, in the morning, I was leaving, and I said, "Well, Cokie, when I come back, what can I bring you?" And she said, "A corned beef sandwich and a beer," because she didn't really think the hospital food was up to snuff. But 2 days later, I walk into the office of the New York Times in Times Square, and they said, "Where the hell you been?" I said, "Excuse me, but my wife just had a baby, and I haven't slept in 2 days." And they said, "Well, sit down. We want to talk to you. We want to send you somewhere." And I said, "Where? Washington?" Because all I wanted to do was come back to the Washington Bureau. And they said, "Nope, Los Angeles." And 3 months later, with a 3-month-old, we moved to Los Angeles. I had been west of the Mississippi for one day in my entire life. And she loved being a mom. And then we had a second child our daughter, Rebecca, who some of you have met here in Washington. She has a new book out, a wonderful new book. She's been doing the circuit of villages. So if you haven't had her, I know she's doing Oasis this week. So if you haven't had Rebecca,
what is her book about?
Her book is, it's interesting. She's picked up her mother's mission of writing about women in history. And so this is her fourth book, but it's her first really big book. And it's a biography of Edith Galt Wilson, who was Woodrow Wilson's wife, who ran the country for 2 years after Wilson had a debilitating stroke in 1918. And so it's a wonderful book. It's gotten a lot of very good reviews in the Post and the Wall Street Journal. So yeah, she's very much her mother's story.
Wonderful.
And she loved being the grandmother. And we are blessed with 6 grandkids. She always, when we have a beach house in South Carolina, and Cokie's deal was that the youngest grandchild, we'd always take the youngest grandchild into our bedroom and wake up with them so that the parents could have a break. And we did that ritual for many years. And so it's, yes, it was, I think that the single, as she got sicker, one of the last public events that she did just a few months before she died was our oldest granddaughter's high school graduation. And she had promised this child that I'll do your best. She was already quite sick at that point, but she did it. And that child just a few weeks ago graduated from college. So time passes, but she was deeply, deeply devoted, to the grandchildren as well.
As you are as well.
I try.
We're not getting any questions, ladies and gentlemen. I know there are things you want to know. So I'm asking for people to have questions.
I mean, I could tell more Cokie stories. I'm more than
sure. Go ahead, and then when we have some questions.
Well, one of the things that I didn't talk a lot about was the role she played within not only in NPR but ABC as in promoting women. And Martha Raddatz, who is today one of the great stars of ABC and the substitute host on Sundays. Martha tells the story about how when she was first hired at ABC, Peter Jennings was sort of the major figure at ABC, and he would not put Martha Raddatz on the air. He just refused to have her on the show. And Cokie went to David Weston, who was then the news director at ABC. David told me the story. Cokie marched into my office and busted my chops, a direct quote from David Weston, saying, "When are you going to put Martha on the air?" She understood that she had clout and she had leverage, and that she was going to use it for other women, not for herself, but for other women. And she did this with Martha, and she did it over and over again with other women. And there's a woman named Sarah Just, who is today the main producer of the NewsHour on PBS. But at the time, she was a young producer on Nightline. Ted Koppel was the host, but Cokie was a frequent substitute host for a number of years for Ted Koppel on Nightline. And Sarah tells the story about how they were together one day in the conference room before the editors and producers of the show gathered to plan that night's show. It was just the two women. And both of them did a lot of needlework. Cokie did a lot of needlework. The men started filtering in. Sarah whispers to Cokie, Cokie, we should put away our needlework because it won't look good with all these guys here. And Cokie looked at him and said, nope, we're keeping it out. And we're going to keep doing it because we want to show we're not them and that we are different and that we do have a different identity. And she just, in a very quiet way, but a very strong way, said, nope, we're going to keep doing the needlework. Be who you are. Be a woman. Don't think you have to adapt to male standards and male priorities. And it was a message she gave over and over again, both personally and professionally.
And things have changed with women in the last 30 years. Still not quite there, but we're getting better all the time. We do have a question. Is it true that Cokie wrote questions for It's Academic?
Yes, that is a true story.
Tell us about that.
Well, you know, we graduated from college in 1964. And so I was coming down here to be a research assistant for the then bureau chief of the New York Times, a wonderful man named James Reston, largely lost to history today, but a very important figure and columnist at the time, Washington bureau chief. And Cokie moved back in here to her girlhood home. And we moved back. I was living downtown. She was living out here. And she had gone to the Wellesley career office before she left Wellesley. And there was a woman named Sophie Altman who had gone to Wellesley and ran a small TV production company here in Washington. She ran it out of the basement of her house, which was on the corner of Macomb Street and Reno Road. And she was the producer of It's Academic. And so she hired one or two young women to help write questions and produce the show. And Cokie got that job. She gave a preference to Wellesley because her daughter also went to Wellesley. And so Cokie got this job, and she worked in the basement of that house on Macomb Street for several years. Interestingly enough, the other young woman who worked next to her was a woman named Jean Furstenberg, who went on to become head of the American Film Institute for many years, and lifelong friend. But so yeah, Cokie not only wrote questions for It's Academic, but she traveled around to different cities because It's Academic was produced separately in a number of other cities. So she would get on the road, and for a couple of weeks, she'd go to Cincinnati for 3 days, and she'd go to Cleveland for 3 days. And they often used the same questions, but they had to have local high schools, right? So the show had to be produced locally. And when we moved to LA, she actually produced It's Academic in Los Angeles as well. But I have a letter as she was getting a little bored with the travel and with the writing, with It's Academic. She writes to a friend of hers, and I have the letter. She's saying, I'm thinking of maybe looking for a new job, and my latest whim, okay, that's the word she used, my latest whim is, maybe I'll try television. Think of what happened is just this precious letter. Maybe it's a whim, but maybe I can be on TV.
There's a question along those lines. And Deborah asked, it must have been hard at times to manage 2 demanding careers and a family. Were there any difficult career decisions for you or her?
Well, of course it was difficult. You're absolutely right. You know, 2 full-time careers, 2 children is more than 100%. We all know that. Look, I'll be completely honest with you. For the first 11 years, virtually every concession and compromise was made by her, not by me. You know, I was the big deal New York Times reporter, and she was the spouse who trailed along, and that's what life in the 60s and 70s was like. And I was hardly a paragon of you know, a feminist sensibility, but honestly, I think we both sort of made that assumption. And we come back to Washington. She starts working for NPR, and there was a moment, and I write about in this book. We hadn't been home more than 3 months or so, and the nuclear meltdown at 3 Mile Island happens. And so NPR says to Cokie, go to 3 Mile Island. And she's really excited for a big story. Early in the morning, and she heads for 3 Mile Island. And then a couple of hours later, I go down to the New York Times bureau, and they say, go to 3 Mile Island. And I said, no, it's too dangerous. We have 2 children at home. It's not fair for both of us to be there. And that was the first moment when her career took precedence over it. It was not the last, but that was the first moment when the tectonic plates started shifting and the balance started shifting. And one of the things that, as political reporters all through the 80s, we traveled a lot, and we tried to minimize the impact on the kids who were teenagers at home. Sometimes we would leapfrog each other. Sometimes we would travel together. But we both of us decided we'd prefer to write about voters rather than politicians. And one of the key reasons was not only did we find the stories more interesting, but it gave us more control over our lives. And for young families, the real critical question is not how many hours you work, it's who decides which hours you work. And when we covered voters, we could control our lives in ways that we couldn't if we were covering Ronald Reagan. You know, if he was going to Milwaukee on Wednesday night and our kid was singing in the chorus at Pyle Junior High, we missed the choir at Pyle Junior High. But if you're covering the ethnic Catholic voters who Reagan was speaking to, you could go to the concert at Pyle and go to Milwaukee on Thursday morning to talk to voters. So we made those concessions, but the truth is this, that 1984, we're both covering the campaign. Our daughter's a freshman at Whitman High School. And we call home. I'm in Chicago, Cokie's in Los Angeles, covering the election. And we call home and our son says, well, Rebecca's not here. She's a freshman in high school. And where is she? Well, she's gone to the senior prom at Whitman High School. And Cokie is aghast, saying, oh, my daughter's first prom, and I'm not there, and this is terrible. And Lee, what was she wearing? And he looks up and says, he's 2 years older, says, well, something blue of yours, Mom. And Cokie's aghast. I'm missing this critical moment in my daughter's growing up. And we're talking to each other on the phone, and we realize, well, she can't call us to tell us she's home safely because we're talking to each other. So we both hang up. I'm sitting there in Chicago. She's sitting there in LA. And our daughter doesn't get home. And she comes home like at 2:30, and we're frantic. And she says, oh, well, because we're dropping everybody else off first because I didn't have any parents at home. So I figured I could be the last one to come home. So yeah, we did a lot of balancing. There was a period when we both were doing Sunday shows. She was doing the ABC Sunday show and I was doing the CNN Sunday show. And that worked pretty well because we were both busy on Sunday mornings. We couldn't. And then she decided to leave her Sunday show in 2002. And she made me promise to give up my Sunday show so that we both would have Sundays off. And then about 3 months before she left her show, CNN changed the format and I got fired from the roundtable. So I come home and I say, Cokie, I've been fired. She said, oh, Stephen, I'm sorry, but not really. I'm actually glad that you got fired because I never thought you'd keep your promise to voluntarily give up your show on Sunday morning. She knew me very well.
Here's a question. How was Cokie's relationship with Sam Donaldson and David Brinkley?
It was very warm, but different for each of the two of them. David Brinkley was a Southerner. He was from Wilmington, North Carolina. And they shared a certain sensibility about being from the South and having grown up with the after effects of David, of course, being older in a segregated society, and Cokie having felt the after effects. And they really bonded over that. And David also really valued her knowledge. I mean, he said, you know, Cokie knows more about Congress than the three guys put together, you know, on the show, which was true. So that was, but that he was older, and it wasn't quite a father-daughter relationship, but it wasn't really of peers, but it was weighted with the Southern connection. And Cokie was very devoted to David Brinkley, and he really gave her her chance, you know. And with Sam, it was different. Sam was more of a contemporary. He was a bit older, but they liked jousting with each other. But when they were paired together as an anchor team, it didn't really work very well. And everybody, I think, would admit that. Sam was not a team player. I mean, he was used to being the star, and he didn't really, and particularly on Sunday mornings, his personality was so abrasive and grating. I mean, it was when he was shouting questions at Ronald Reagan, that was where Sam was at his best, where he was not taking any, a no for an answer from Ronald Reagan. But on Sunday morning, the pairing wasn't terribly good. But they, on a personal basis, they remained very good friends, and with George Will as well. George Will tells the story, like a quote in the book, that when Cokie started doing the show, and it was a jolt for these three guys to have a woman that outspoken as part of their regular roundtable. But they all realized how smart she was and how quick she was. Cokie did many things very well, but live broadcasting was among her best formats because she was so quick and so sharp, and and so funny. And George's phrase was, after a couple of weeks, and when I thought about Cokie, he says, "The varsity has arrived." How we put it.
Steve, you've been so generous with your time, and it's after 2, and I could listen to you for a long time, but unfortunately our time is up, and I want to thank you so much for sharing all of this and for sharing your time and your wonderful stories. Thank you so much.
Well, I appreciate it very much, and this is our community, this is our neighborhood, and it's always a pleasure to meet with old friends. Thanks, Susan.
And you're so open with everything. You make us all feel part of your community. So thank you for that. So thank you, everybody, for coming. I hope you enjoyed this program. And if you are more interested in other programs that we have, our Chevy Chase at Home website is available. And please join us again. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Have a good one. Bye.